Number 1.
A few years ago, I worked as a bartender in Hollywood. The bar itself is this hole-in-the-wall type place that hipsters love to frequent, located on the first floor of a failing hotel. A little background on the property. Long before this building was gutted and gentrified to house trust fund hipsters, it used to be a hotel. In the 1930s and 40s, it was an elegant, posh place where Hollywood stars used to dance the night away, drink merrily, and live the good life. It then became a depressing hotel where prostitutes turned cheap tricks and drug dealers strung people out till they looked like ghosts. In the 1970s, it became a home for the aging citizens of Hollywood, probably for the same folks who used to frequent its bars in the 1930s. Then the property was sold to an entrepreneur, who planned to turn it back into a hotel. After sinking several hundred thousands of dollars in removing the asbestos and renovating the entire inside of the hotel, the owner sold the property to another entrepreneur, who continued to invest in carving out the cancerous past of the building, installing upscale lofts and crammed dorm-like studios for the not-so-starving artist of Silver Lake. But before the hotel was even completed in the late 1920s, a mental institution used to exist on the same plot of land. And if you haven't heard about mental institutions from the late 1800s and early 1900s, they weren't the grandest of places to work out psychological issues. If anything, they were places where defenseless people suffered at the hands of doctors who had the authority to practice whatever experimental treatment they could conceive on a population of stigmatized and socially shunned folks. I came to learn about this history from my boss and co-workers, who also described bizarrely cool drafts that would sweep through the hot, sweaty bar during peak hours, glasses and beer bottles that would shatter for no apparent reason, and doors that would curiously open and then slam shut on their own. I took all their stories with a grain of salt. With such a history, I was sure that there were certainly some spiritual imprints left on the corridors of that building with the passage of time. Energy cannot be created nor destroyed, it just changes shapes. Some happenings and human experiences are so wild and dense that, if they abruptly end, there's certainly a bit of residual energy that never truly leaves completely. Considering the building's background, I was certain that all sorts of people died in this building over the years, from drug overdoses and murders to old folks just passing on. So when it was my turn to close, I always made sure to ask a couple of the restocking fellows to stick around a while longer to help clean up. I'd break them off some of my tips, while I closed the register and handled my paperwork. I didn't like being alone in that bar, nobody did really. But I could get over the strange vibe so long as there were a couple other people there to keep me company. One night, my boss decided to run the show that shift, and it was unusually busy and crowded. By the time we closed, the place was a complete disaster. The kitchen was a giant mess, and the entire bar was littered with beer bottles, plates, and glasses everywhere. My boss asked me to help with the cleaning, and specifically asked me to take a cart full of used beer bottles down into the basement, where all the recyclables were kept. I didn't think too much of it. I was delirious. It was nearly 3 in the morning, and I hadn't eaten anything the entire day. I just wanted to get my work done and go home to sleep. I took the freight elevator down, and when the ping sounded and the elevator doors opened, I pushed the cart forward and turned toward the small storage room where the hotel kept all the glass bottles and recyclables, which was just down the hall from the laundry room. Usually around this time, it'd be very busy and noisy down here. A graveyard shift of workers would be bustling around, washing, drying, and folding sheets and towels. But that night, it was eerily silent. I pushed on, listening as the bottles clanked together in the cart. My ears throbbed from the loud music playing all night in the bar. I stopped for a second and noticed it was dead silent. All I was able to make out was the slight buzz coming from the fluorescent lights above. A cool draft brushed against my flesh, and I watched as the hair on my arms rose and then settled. I shivered. My destination was just down the hall, the last room in the corridor. I soldiered on, pushing the cart, listening as my footsteps and clanging bottles echoed down the hall. As I ventured further away from the elevator, I began to feel a strange sense of dread and sadness in the pit of my stomach, which I remember finding alarming. The silence began to feel dreadful and claustrophobic. A sense of deep sadness began to spread through my chest, and I felt like that at any moment I was just going to burst into sobs. I didn't understand it. The place creeped me out, and I wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. Once I reached the recyclable room, I pushed the cart through the door and flipped on the light switch, and that's when I saw her. She was an older lady with dirty, white, stringy hair and a deep gash on her face, her eyes swollen black and shut, dressed in a filthy nightgown. She was standing upright against the opposite wall with her arms wrapped around herself in what apparently was a straitjacket. At first, I thought that she might have been a homeless person who had sneaked into the basement from outside to find shelter. This happens every once in a while. But when I realized she was wearing a straitjacket, my heart stopped. I glanced at her legs, only to realize that she didn't have any. Her nightgown went down to what I thought would have been her knees, but there was nothing underneath that. She was just floating there, looking straight at me. I turned around and ran back toward the elevator. When I reached the elevator, I began frantically pressing the up button, all the while glancing back toward the room where I'd seen her. She didn't come out. I heard the elevator door ping and the door slid open. I jumped in and pressed the door close button. As the doors began to close, she appeared right outside the elevator in the hallway. Her straitjacket having come undone, she extended both arms out toward me and her mouth open. A sharp screech filled the elevator. I covered my ears and the elevator doors closed completely. Once I was back in the bar, I grabbed a bottle of bourbon and poured myself a shot. My hands were shaking so violently. "What happened to you? Where's the cart? We have more bottles to take down there," my boss yelled at me. "I'm not going back down there. I saw her. She scared the hell out of me. She screeched at me," I exclaimed, and then took my shot. "I need you to go back down there and grab that cart. We need to get this place cleaned up," my boss yelled. "No, I'm not going down there again. I'm done," I said. "You're done, eh? Well, if you don't go back, you're fired," he said, his tone even. "You're going to fire me because I don't want to go down there and be face to face with whatever it was that was down there? You know weird shit happens here, and just now I saw her. I damn near shit my pants. Look at me." I raised my trembling hands to his face. I'm not trying to be dramatic. I really saw an old woman in a straitjacket down there. Well, my boss fired me on the spot. I grabbed my bag and left, relieved to be out of there. Several nights later, my boss called me to apologize and offer me my job back. Apparently, news got out that I'd been fired because I didn't want to go to the basement where I saw that apparition. Some of the busboys, who had seen her in the past, talked to a few of the housekeepers who frequently went down into the basement to leave baskets of dirty laundry in the laundry area, and they had all come forward to vouch for me. They told my boss of the old woman who periodically appears in the basement, floating above the ground, of her armed gestures that seem to warn people not to enter certain rooms, and of the horrific screeches that emanate from her mouth. Number 2. Dave always said it was how he wanted to go, just like his father did, and just like his grandfather did. It's the highest honor in our culture to die for your loved ones. He was a soldier way before I'd even met him. The soldier part of him was what I loved best. That passion, that dedication, that knowledge of who he was. The uniformed men who bring me the news don't ever smile. They don't pat me on the shoulder as they leave my doorstep. They don't close the door. They salute me firmly and trot away in their shiny black shoes on sliding silently down the doorframe until I'm crouching on the ground watching their car pull away. I can't breathe. I lie on my belly and stare into nothing. I don't know how long I'm on the ground before I start making calls. First the hard ones. His mother, my sister, then I begin to call family and friends. They say, "Oh honey." They say, "Are you sure you're all right?" I respond that crying about it won't bring him back. I respond that things are going to have to get done. Then the door is opening. People start to come over. Everyone's just opening the door and walking right in without knocking, and I feel violated. I wonder if they would go away and leave me alone if I locked the door. I wonder if they would climb in my window and just break into my house just so they can give me yellow custard and cookies in an effort to fill the void. There are so many people. We got married the first day that it was legalized in Japan. We were the little celebrity couple and people were still pointing us out in public, and we would wrinkle our nose at each other and kiss as if the fingernails were tapping on the champagne glasses at our wedding again. But now they're in my house, and instead of smiles and pointed fingers, there are tears and hands on my shoulders. I don't have time to process how I'm feeling until the last person finally leaves, my neighbor, Miss Dolores, who keeps asking, am I sure I don't want to spend the night with her, because her husband, Tom, died 5 years ago, and the nights are still the hardest. She says I shouldn't be alone, but right now, I can't stand anyone else around me. I leave the food sitting out. It's not mine anyway. I go to bed and pull the comforter up over my head. I can feel reality pressing down on my sternum. He's dead. I'll never share this bed with him again. The thought breaks me. The next 2 weeks aren't real. They're phases. I've lost someone I love, and I don't know how to deal. I get out of bed to lock the door, and then I don't move for 3 days. My muscles are so tired from crying, I lock the door, and I don't answer the phone. Then my strength comes back. I get angry. I get hammered on a bottle of 15-year-old Talisker that we'd been saving for our first anniversary, and then I start making phone calls. I sway around the apartment while I blame his death on the war. I rationalize that if the United States hadn't bombed us in the first place, we would still be the first gay married couple on this side of the state. I call as many military departments as I can get my hands on. I call every public phone number I can find. I scream at assistants who refuse to put me through to who I wanted to talk to. I get hung up on while I'm trying to explain that if we could all just get all of our world leaders in a mandatory meeting and have them all smoke a bowl and decide on a better way to solve our issues as separate countries, we could stop killing families and widowing spouses. Eventually, the alcoholism phase passed. I'm exhausted. I haven't gone back to work. I finally unlock my door and leave the house, but only to get more food, and I haven't eaten in 2 days. I'm in the bread aisle. He and I would always get 2 packs of bread, one wheat and one white, because we could never agree. I grab the white bread for me, I grab the wheat bread for him, and then I remember. I start to cry. A woman next to me starts to edge away. She doesn't know if it's social protocol to comfort me. I brought home the grain. For once, I decided to let him win the argument. But when I got home, I take the white bread out of my grocery bag. I figure I must be out of it, so I shrug it off. But stranger things start happening. One day, his toothbrush is sitting on the counter. It wasn't here yesterday. The first time I set it back in the drawer. When it appears again out of nowhere, I put it away again. I can't stand to throw it away just yet. I can't touch his clothes in the closet either. I set my toothbrush on the other side of the cabinet. The next day, it's sitting out again. I can't bring myself to touch it. I'm starting to get nervous. Things start getting weirder. I play music from my computer and it stops and switches to his library. We had different taste in music, and I distinctly know his from mine, but every time I begin an album, it'll abruptly switch to an album that belonged to him. I stop playing music. One night while I'm half asleep in a lucid state, I feel a physical arm squeeze around my torso, just like he used to do. It's warm and firm as it curls around my front. The first time I felt it, I forgot for a couple seconds, and then I jumped up out of bed and threw the covers back. No one was there, but my back was still warm. Sometimes I hear him call my name. I'll hear him call me from the kitchen when I sit on the couch. I'll feel the bathroom door open when I'm in the shower. I'll check the kitchen and I'll pull back the shower curtain, but of course, there's no one there. I stop sleeping and I start to drink more instead. After furniture starts moving, I go to a psychic. I'm drunk. I haven't shaved or showered in a week. She takes one look at me. She's draped in blankets and shawl, and when she puts her arm around me, I feel warm for the first time since I heard. She leads me to a large chair that swallows me. "He's still here," she says. "No," I shake my head. "My husband died. There has to be another explanation." "You're being haunted," she says. "It will continue until you let go. You're keeping him in limbo, and you won't let him pass." I don't believe her until I'm standing up to leave, and she says one more thing. "Dispose of my clothes." I stare at her. She doesn't move. She's not looking at me. She's looking over my shoulder. I can't break eye contact with her. I'm too afraid. "Dispose of my clothes," she says. "Dispose of my toothbrush. Let me go." She doesn't get up. She stares over my shoulder, nodding to someone I'll never see again. I leave, and it's time. On the drive home, I think about acceptance. I keep feeling little puffs of air on the back of my neck like he used to do to tickle me. I am haunted, I realize. I've been afraid to let him go. I'm so afraid to be alone. When I get home, I break his toothbrush in half. I move all the furniture to the original spot. For the first time in weeks, I hit the gym, and I work out so hard I can barely walk to the car afterwards. And for the first time in weeks, I don't drink myself to sleep. I decide I'm no longer afraid. I crawl under the covers, and I expect to feel an arm around me. I expect to feel an exhale on the back of my neck. But I don't. The only thing I can feel is the beating of my own heart. The only thing I can hear is the fact that, for the first time in months, I'm alone. Number 3. When I was 8, my mother's mother's sister, my great-aunt Regina, passed away. I barely knew her, but my mother took me and my brothers and sisters out to Indianapolis to attend her wake. There were many relatives visiting for the funeral, and the accommodations were limited, so we ended up staying in her now empty house. Her husband, my great-uncle Peter, had passed away a few years prior. Of course, by empty I mean that it was no longer occupied. As for furnishings, though, the house was palatial. Every room was filled with antique furniture, antique lamps, all manner of extravagant decor. We, my two brothers and I, were directed to a dusty living room and a small wicker basket of ancient wooden toys and told that beyond that basket we were not allowed to play with anything else. No climbing on the furniture, no turning anything on, nada. With that one rule in place, we were then foolishly left to our own devices. As everyone else left to attend a reception before the funeral itself, we were abandoned in a crypt of the living room with a basket of wooden blocks and toy trains. So, naturally, we ignored the baby toys and started exploring the enormous house. We didn't touch any of the things, we just went from room to room. The place was so big, though, that we quickly got separated and were calling each other from room to room, eventually making a game of it, purposely losing my little brother until he'd cry. Through a foyer, I found a set of winding stairs leading up to a second floor and followed them. The second floor was just a long hallway with doors all up and down and on both sides. All of them were closed. One door in particular caught my attention because someone had driven 2 hooks into the wall on either side of it and draped a long sash across them, effectively cordoning off the doorway. This made me curious. Ignoring the calls from downstairs my brothers, I walked down the hall to the door with the sash. There was nothing that immediately jumped out at me as being different about the other door itself, just a plain white door with a brass knob and a key sticking out of the keyhole. I jiggled the knob and found it locked. Inside me, I fought with myself for all of about 10 seconds as to leaving the door alone and going back downstairs. But I wanted to know what was in there, so I turned the key and tried the knob again. I pushed the door open inward and there was this long sigh, like it had been holding its breath and was finally exhaling. The inside of the room was as black as night. Even with the door open and a lamp on a small table just behind me across the hall, the light stopped at the door on the other side of the door frame, as if the room were swallowing it. I couldn't even see the door, except for the edge and hinges. It was like I was standing on a precipice of nothing, and I got dizzy just looking into it. I had to hold on to the door frame to keep myself steady at first. Then I took a step back and felt a rush of vertigo fade. At the same time, all the sounds around me seemed to become muffled. From downstairs I could hear my little brother crying again, but it sounded so distant. Conversely, my breathing became loud in my ear. I wasn't breathing heavily, but it was just a thunder, and I started holding my breath. When I did, and a hush came over me, my ears sensitized, and I heard it. Tap, 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 tap. It was coming from inside the room, inside the blackness, maybe 15 or 20 feet into the room, moving perpendicular to where I was standing. I felt dizzy again for a second, and I had to let out a ragged gasp of air before I started turning blue. The tapping stopped for a second when I exhaled, then started anew, only now it was different. Tap, 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 tap. Whatever was making the sound was now moving toward the door. I was mesmerized by listening to it, and I just stared into the nothingness, waiting to see what was approaching. I was scared, but at the same time I was frozen in place by my own curiosity, damn it to hell. Tap, 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 tap. I noticed that the sash across the door was moving, fluttering gently in the middle. Into the room, out into the hall. Into the room, out to the hall. And as I watched, all I could think was that the room was breathing. I bumped my ass against a little table with a lamp on it before I realized I had started shuffling slowly back from the door. I reached back and gripped the edge of the table for support, and still the tapping drew nearer and nearer. Tap, 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 tap. And under it, I detected another awful sound. Clack, click, click, clack, clack. Like somebody gnashing their teeth together over and over. I couldn't even hear the first floor anymore. My breathing had gone quiet. All I could hear was the tapping and the clacking coming closer and closer at any second. Their maker would step into the doorway and show me its teeth and its claws. It was an insane image of a monster with long tapping nails and hungry gnashing teeth that drove me forward toward the door. I sucked down a deep breath like I was about to plunge into icy waters, and then leaned across the billowing sash, stretching my arm into the room, into that all-enshrouding darkness, and grabbed for the doorknob. I could barely reach it, but I hooked my fingertips across it and pulled, stringing my shoulder even as I held the door frame with my other hand and leaned as far as I could into the pitch black. I pulled, and the door swung slowly toward me. I almost cried. I was so grateful to feel the door moving. The clacking sound was right in my ear. I imagined hot breath on my neck. As I got a better grip and the door swung shut, I bumped against something for a moment, and the tap that was right at my feet made a scritch for a second, and then the door swung shut completely, and I held tight to the knob before remembering the key, turning it and stumbling back, almost overturning the table and lamp. I was shaking so badly that I ended up collapsing to my knees. That just couldn't support me anymore. The tapping had stopped. The clacking had stopped. The sash was askew from my draping myself across it to reach into the room, but I didn't care. I wrapped my arms around myself and rocked for a moment, listening until the world seemed normal again. I ran back downstairs and told my brothers what had happened. My little brother didn't like the story. My older brother wanted to see the room for himself. I told him not to do it, but he was dead set on seeing it. I was in a panic, trying to get him to not go. I even told him I'd just made it up to scare them, but he wanted to see. I followed him upstairs, begging and pleading for him to leave it alone. All the way down the hall, I could tell when he saw the sash across the doorway that he wasn't going to back down. But when we got to the door, he tried the knob and found it locked. He turned and looked at me, frowning, and I realized that when I'd stumbled back, I'd pulled the key out of the keyhole and was now gripping it tightly in my fist. My brother didn't know about the key. I started to smile, and he mistook my relief for smugness and stormed back downstairs, my little brother following close behind. I quickly set the key behind the lamp on the little table and ran from that door. That evening, when our parents returned, we were all led upstairs to our selected bedroom on the other end of the hall from the room of pitch black. As we reached the top of the stairs, I asked my mother, "Mom, what room is that?" "Which one?" "The one with the thing across the door." "That was Uncle Peter's office. He was a lawyer, and he'd bring his work home with him. He'd do it in there." "Why's it sealed off like that?" "I'm not sure. I do know that before he passed away, Uncle Peter spent a lot of his time in his office. After he died, Aunt Regina locked the room and wouldn't let anyone go in. I guess she wanted to keep it just like it was when he was alive." I laid awake that night, listening to my brother's snore and imagining I could hear the tapping coming down the hallway to my room. When I finally slept, I had a nightmare that I was in the room of pitch black, blind, and something was hugging me to its chest and clacking its teeth in my ear. At one point, I woke up with a need to pee, but the thought of finding the bathroom in the dark had me thinking a wet bed would be preferable. Somehow I held it all night. The next day, we attended Aunt Regina's funeral. It was rather surreal for me as an 8-year-old, seeing this dead person in a coffin. Even more surreal was the photo someone had chosen to put up beside her and hang a wreath around. It was an enlarged color photo of her and my great-uncle Peter, standing side by side in the yard in front of their luxurious house and smiling. Despite being in her late 70s, she was permed and pretty, wearing a green jacket, her arm intertwined with his. Uncle Peter, on the other hand, was pale and sickly-looking despite his smile. His eyes were sunken, his hair shock white and his face gaunt. He was hunched over in a business suit, gripping a black cane in his left hand to keep himself up. He had such big teeth. Hey guys, it's Dawn. Want more? Hit that red subscribe button and follow the links in the description to follow us on Twitter and Google+. Also, if you have any scary stories, creepy artwork, or disturbing pictures you'd like to see featured in one of our videos, send them to the email address below. We'd love to hear from you guys. Thanks for watching, and until next time.